Gotti, for allowing me to come and spend about 15 minutes with you this morning to provide maybe a little bit of a different perspective, which is that of the end users. I think the end users of all this marvelous new technology are the patients and the physicians at the end of the day. And how do we begin to grapple with all the changes that are now coming forth at such a faster and faster rate? I think that we, the physicians, are at risk of being the bottleneck in this, that all this deluge of information coming down is going to paralyze us in our ability to act upon that. And that's something that, well, perhaps if it doesn't keep me up at night, I often wake up in the morning with that on my mind, so I've been thinking about it overnight. I think that it's important to think with all this information in the context of a physician seeing a patient and having 5 or 10 minutes to make a decision. How do you access that information through your computer systems? You can't have a complete data dump. There's just too much there. So how do you decide in advance what aspects and what granularity do you need for that data? And how does that data feed into applications that we call clinical decision support tools that will take that data and then analyze it and give a list of possible actionable items? And who will develop those softwares independent of the electronic systems that we have? And further, I'd like to also put out the idea that we have a split between clinical care and clinical research that has been allowed to develop in the United States, at least. And the result of that is that only about 3% of cancer patients actually go on clinical trials, which means that 97% of the experience that we have on patient care is not routinely captured or analyzed to further research. And the ability to capture all data on all patients is fundamentally a game changer for us in that regard. So the concept that we use in the clinical arena to talk about these ideas is called rapid learning healthcare systems. The concepts are that every patient's data will be entered into an electronic format, and so it can be captured and mined. This speaks to the idea of big data, although I think of big data as unstructured data, and it is much more preferable if the data that we need is entered in a structured, findable, mineable fashion that has good validity. But we need to have also unstructured data. We need to expand our database to include all patients. That means we have to have a vision that all patients are treated at hospitals and medical offices where there are electronic medical records that capture the data and can speak to each other, so data can be exchanged and maintain liquidity. The value of that is we will have real-time and real-world data. So the data will be captured much more quickly as things are actually developing, and we can respond to it much more quickly. And the data will reflect the complexity of real-life patients. So the limitations of clinical trials are that often they don't really reflect real-life patients. They're patients who have normal kidneys, every organ system is normal except they have cancer. For my disease. And that's not the reality of what really happens. And when you give that drug to a patient, once it's been approved, you see all sorts of side effects that were not anticipated from the randomized clinical trials. We need to get away from thinking of a medical chart as an instrument for individual health. The paper chart that doctors like me used for many years were one chart, one patient. And if you had 100, well, you had, say, 6 doctors, an orthopedic doctor, a cardiologist, they each maintained their own chart, their own paper chart. And it was a one-on-one situation. You couldn't exchange that data. With electronic data interoperability, we can begin to think about populations of patients. So not just the last female patient I saw with breast cancer who had 2 lines of chemotherapy, but the last 100 or 1,000 patients with that same demographic could be pulled together for data analysis. And increasingly, these concepts are underlying federal policy making. So they are important because they're driving policy decisions that affect reimbursement and drug coverage. This is a slide showing, which is pretty recent, showing the current pipelines for oncology drugs of 10 of the large pharma companies. I put this up because I remember going to an FDA meeting about 3 years ago, and they were bemoaning the fact that the pipeline was drying up, that there was something going wrong with personalized medicine, that there weren't many drugs coming through the pipeline. But you can see that worry has now gone. In fact, the pipeline is now starting to build, and that's more robust. However, that means there will be a lot more drugs coming to trials. How do we find the patients that had those diagnostic tests that you just heard about? How do we locate them? How do we recruit them? And how do we decide which patients get which drugs, and perhaps in combinations? So this is one of the more simpler diagrams, this kind of spider network of different signal transduction pathways in a cell that drives a cancer to grow. And you can see multiple lines of inputs that are signaling growth, apoptosis, growth regulation, cell cycling, metastatic capabilities. So this is probably a very simplified model. But the concept of one disease, one drug, or one genetic aberration, one disease, one drug, oncologists really don't believe that in our hearts that really is what's going to happen. Yes, we will have Gleevec, just like we had MOP for Hodgkin's disease in the 1960s, where one drug was a breakthrough. But the reality is that we have to prepare for is that there will be multiple targets that need to be understood. And we need to, so what are the implications of that? One implication is the question of the granularity or the level of understanding we need to know about any particular, you pick the area that you want on the slide. Are we talking about the genetic mutation variants? Are we talking about the messenger RNA expression levels? Are we talking about the protein expression level? So what are we actually using to describe that focus in the signal transduction pathway? Also, where does that target sit in the pathway? Is it upstream? Is it downstream? What are the bypass mechanisms? Where do other pathways come in and interact and can disrupt your agent from working properly? So we don't have right now a ontology or hierarchical understanding of these growing pathways. You've heard many people talk about the concept that we will not talk about lung cancer, we will not talk about the breast cancer. The future will be that we will have a molecular or proteomics profile of a disease and predict therapies, and I believe that's true. But if that is so, what is the mechanism that we use to describe that? How do we fit into a schema that we don't have yet at this time? And I can tell you that no one's working on it at this point. I think this is a dire need from the industry perspective, from the regulatory perspective, and from the provider-patient care perspective. So this concept of personalized medicine, or is now, I suspect it's being switched to precision medicine, so I put both words in so I would be current at least for another few weeks before someone changes their mind. But the concept of personalized medicine, which is still the dominant phrasing right now, is defining diseases by their panomic data profile. You've heard that all yesterday, and the complexity of that, and how rapidly that's progressing. Adequately done, it would address the complexity of diseases. You saw that in the last slide. We need to have systems to have digital capture of that complex molecular data. Currently, right now, I can tell you in my office, when I send off a test, I get a piece of paper that's sent over, and when I ask the company, what should I do with this, they say, well, scan it in. Well, scan data is, how old is that? And you can't mine it, you can't extract it, you don't even know where it is. It's just a garbage dump to do that. Biobanks and longitudinal health. So we are, in a lot of the talks today, I think you were hearing the concept that we have a disease and let's study it. But when we're thinking about longitudinal health, and this reflects my healthcare system, which is a 1,000 physician strong physician, we have patient data before the patient was diagnosed with the disease. And if we collect biosamples prior to disease diagnosis, we have access to both biological material as well as clinical history before the disease that can allow us to perhaps generate better risk model assessments and cancer prevention strategies. Last night after this meeting, I went to San Francisco for a meeting of our research consortium. I belong to the Palo Alto Medical Foundation, which is in this area, but we belong to a bigger organization called Sutter Health, which is through Northern California. And I was talking that, last week someone called me up and told me she was doing work on diabetes, and she is collecting serum samples from all patients with diabetes. And then the person I was talking to at California Pacific Medical Center said, we've been collecting blood samples on patients having routine mammography. I didn't know this at all, but it blew me away. He said we have about 20,000 blood samples on women who came in for screening mammography, and about 500 now have been diagnosed with breast cancer. So that's an incredible resource to have. So biobanks, but then the question went on to, well, how is that specimen collected? How is it annotated? How can we search for it? How did you get consent for that? What was the processing and collection so that the scientific usefulness of that data was there? So all those questions then immediately come up. clinical trial recruitments. It's an increasing concern that if we're looking at very small populations, how will we find them? Our networks for clinical research will need to expand, and we can use electronic record to identify those patients and recruit them to trial. FDA regulatory approval, you've just heard some of that. And predictive algorithms, or these clinical decision support tools that will help us find these patients for research studies or mine their data. They are very dependent on having the data enter in properly. So garbage in is garbage out. So how do we assure that that information is entered reliably and consistently? So access and affordability. Well, this is, oh, there we go. So I just want to point out that you're used to seeing these two bottom lines, that is the gross domestic product and the rising cost of healthcare. But what's different about this slide is you're used to seeing a very large difference in the slope. And on this slide, they're compressed to look like it's almost trivial. So why is that? Well, that's because the scale had to be changed to reflect the rising costs of cancer drugs and cancer care. So the answer here is that this is really not affordable if we are getting small improvements in benefit. We really need to justify home runs if we're going to be able to afford these drugs or justify these drugs, and even then perhaps not. So this is a slide of several recently approved drugs, immunotherapy or targeted therapies, and the cost for delivering these care to patients. And you can imagine that, one, this is not very affordable. But second, it would be justifiable if you had a very high response rate. So instead of the traditional 20%, 25% response rates that clinicians feel is adequate for a drug, we need to have the 75, 80, 90% response rates with durable remissions and clinical benefit to justify the cost of these drugs. Now, I think a targeted therapy and personalized health can deliver on that, but it is a game changer in terms of how we think about these drugs. So who is working on these issues? Who's beginning to coalesce around it? Institute of Medicine, I think, has been a major player in the last year, developing workshops and thought conferences on how a national digital infrastructure will look. How can we tie all the electronic records that are being out there with all the different vendors? There are probably about 300 vendors out there, electronic records. How can we get them to all work on a consistent engineering standard so that data can be reliably obtained and exchanged? The NIH is having some difficulties right now with their cancer informatics program, so they're a bit sidelined at CBIT. The National Coordinator for Health Information Technology is a part of the Department of Health and Human Services. It sits up there with the FDA, with CMS, and it is charged with setting national policy for information technology. We're setting some of the standards for information exchange and what is required to collect that data. CMS and FDA. FDA has many irons in the fire. Electronic case report forms, which is working with the NCI to harmonize so that data can be extracted out of clinical records for drug approval processes. And CDISC, which is an FDA sponsor organization that is working with the FDA to develop electronic transmissions of data which are necessary for clinical trials. CDISC, in my conversations with them a couple weeks ago, is now looking to the next FDA mandate, which is to develop disease-specific data elements that need to be collected that will inform policy, and so they're looking at oncology as another target and are looking to work